Good morning. My name is Blair Rubel, and I'm director of the Kennan Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And on behalf of the center and its president and director, Lee Hamilton, I would like to welcome all of you to what is going to be a very stimulating day. Before we get underway, I need to ask that everyone turn off all mobile communication devices. This is particularly important today because it will interfere with the simultaneous translation equipment. For those of you who are Russian speakers, simultaneous translation from English into Russian is available on channel 1, and when speakers are going to be speaking in Russian, particularly Ms. Alexeyeva, we will have a consecutive translation. I also want to acknowledge the sponsor of this event and our partner in this venture, the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. This is the third major conference we've held here in Washington with the Jackson Foundation, and it is really a rare treat to work with them. They are thoughtful and professional and wise and pleasant to work with, and they are really perfect partners, and it's been a pleasure. And I especially want to thank Laura Iglitzin, who is you'll hear from in a moment, because I want to thank her both for her work with us, but as importantly, her work over the years, both at the Jackson Foundation and before, on issues of human rights in Russia and elsewhere. I also want to mention two Kennan Institute staff people who have been instrumental in this project, Joe Dresden and Will Pomerantz. I should note that we're joined by many members of both the Jackson Foundation Board and the Kennan Institute Advisory Council, and I'd like to welcome all of them, and I want to especially thank anyone who climbed on an airplane to get here, and I hope that you'll be able to climb on an airplane and get out of town before the snow arrives tomorrow. Well, we're gathered here to examine the history and legacy of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the Trade Act of 1974. And we're joined by individuals who were instrumental in the passage of the legislation and by individuals whose lives were directly affected by the legislation. And we want to use a discussion of this history as a way of also opening a conversation about the human rights situation in Russia today, and look not just back, but also look to the future. And we've been able to assemble a really extraordinary group of speakers. Many of them are known for being provocative and not shy. So I am about to step away and turn the floor over to the speaker. But first, I'm going to turn the podium over to John Hempelman, who is president of the Henry Jackson Foundation. John worked with Senator Jackson in the Senate and on his presidential campaign, and he's a Seattle lawyer. So, John, welcome.
Thank you, Blair. On behalf of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, I'd like to add my welcome to that of Blair's. And I'm delighted to be with you all here today to discuss this important topic. The Henry M. Jackson Foundation was founded 25 years ago after the death of Senator Jackson, and we have sought to focus our work on his unfinished legacy. One of the most important pieces of our work we embarked on as early as 1989 was to establish ties with human rights organizations in what was then the Soviet Union. Since that time, we've granted over $3 million to human rights organizations in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and we've worked with dozens of NGOs. The goal of our foundation is to be a useful partner and supporter of the vibrant community in Russia that is seeking to shed light on that painful Soviet past, but also to ensure that the Russia of today and tomorrow preserves and protects the hard-fought gains during the Yeltsin era. That's not always been easy, but the senator never backed away from a challenge. And thus the Jackson Foundation has stayed the course of participation with our friends in Russia when other foundations have been forced or chosen to pull their resources out of the region. There's another point I'd like to stress. Senator Jackson believed that there should be an in-depth relationship between academic scholarship in our universities and those in the policy world that help shape our foreign policy. Thus, his views were informed by his close contact with many scholars. The senator studied the facts, and as he said many times, the facts will lead you to the right conclusion. He was also a man of great integrity, and he had the ability to change his views when the facts and circumstances demanded that his views be changed. And he was not afraid to hear opposition and to take new opinions into account. It's for all these reasons and for the Foundation's deep commitment to the cause of a free and just Russian society that we wanted to work with the Kennan Institute on today's conference. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment was passed 35 years ago. In fact, it was signed 35 years ago last month by President Ford. It affected the lives of millions of Russian citizens who obtained the freedom to emigrate. Some of you are with us here today, and we are proud to stand with you. It's remarkable that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment has lasted all these 35 years. And we'll hear some interesting discussion about whether it should last any more years. But what we heard yesterday during the briefing at the Woodrow Wilson on the Hill luncheon we had yesterday was a very, very passionate opinion of many people that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment is one of the most important symbols of freedom. So while we are going to look back a little bit today, it's equally important, maybe even more important, that we look forward. The Foundation wants to be a participant in the future of U.S. and Russian relations so that we hope we can be as effective in the 21st century as the senator was in the last century in helping to advance human rights in Russia. And so we will be listening closely and working with all of the voices in Russia who are participating in the protection and the advancement of human rights. It's our hope that this conference today will explore new opportunities and grapple with the new challenges so that we can help assure that human rights is a constant in the Russia of today and tomorrow. So thank you for being with us. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first panel. My good friend Laura Eglitzen is the executive director of the Jackson Foundation, and I can assure you that's the reason we're a success. Laura has studied and been active in Russian-U.S. relations for many years. For example, when she was here in Washington, she ran the Congressional Roundtable on U.S.-Soviet relations. She knows this topic very well because her master's thesis was on the impact of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Laura.
Thank you. Thank you, John. It's a little daunting to have someone announce that you know the topic very well when you're sitting next to Richard Pearl and Mark Talisman, who crafted and launched, with the help of Representative Vanik and Senator Jackson, this important amendment. But I do think that this is a very important topic, and as John said, yesterday we had 75 staffers on the Hill discussing human rights in Russia and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and I was quite stunned to recognize the continuing power and, to a certain degree, controversy of the amendment, and some of the same arguments being made about how the amendment irritates the Russians, and yet the amendment is a symbol of America's perhaps dissatisfaction with some of the issues of human rights in Russia even today. So I look forward to a discussion of all these issues. This panel starts by looking back, and we have, as I said, two very distinguished guests. I'll introduce you one by one, and we'll start, Richard, with you. Richard Pearl is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He may need no introduction to many of you, but he was chairman of the Defense Policy Board, and he also served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy in 1981 to 87 during the Reagan administration. He, as well as Mark Talisman, is one of the original authors of the amendment. So, Richard, we're delighted to have you join us today. Yeah.
Well, Laura, thank you very much, and thanks to the Wilson Center and to the Henry Jackson Foundation for putting this program together. I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I would like to make a couple of points to begin this discussion. The first is that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, I believe, had an impact far greater than the immediate technical and legal imposition of a burden on the Soviet leadership. And that burden was laid out in the legislation. It's very clear. The legislation denies both most favored nation status and now called normal trade, permanent normal trade, and access to credits, direct or indirect, to any non-market economy that denies its citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate. Those are pretty much the exact words of the legislation. And the reason why I begin with this is that there's a great deal of confusion in the contemporary discussion of Jackson-Vanik, and indeed that confusion has been present for many years. People talk about the amendment who have never read it. Some people get it wrong even after they've read it. The amendment is very clear. It applies only to non-market economies that deny their citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate. If it's a market economy, Jackson-Vanik does not apply legally. If a non-market economy allows its citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate, Jackson-Vanik does not apply legally. It must be obvious that Jackson-Vanik does not apply to Russia, which is both a market economy of a sort and which allows its citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate, which is why it astonishes me that there is a debate with passion on both sides about repealing Jackson-Vanik. And indeed, the demand for repeal is led by Russians who either don't understand the amendment, haven't read the amendment, or have been led to believe that somehow they will continue to be burdened by the amendment until it is repealed, as opposed to what is really required in this case, which is simply a presidential determination that Russia is in compliance. It's a one-time determination, not an annual statement. And I don't understand why that determination was not made long ago. The advantage of making the determination is that it would relieve the debate about repeal of Jackson-Vanik while leaving Jackson-Vanik as what arguably was the single most important piece of human rights legislation of the last century and has not been surpassed in this century and may never be surpassed. It was an extraordinary effort in which both houses of Congress, by overwhelming majorities, although after rather long debate, tied benefits received by the Soviet Union from the United States, both favorable tariff access to Soviet products and potentially access to U.S. government credits, tied that to free immigration. Now, in the practical realities of the day, completely free immigration from a totalitarian Soviet Union was out of the question. But it was clear to the authors of the amendment that the Soviet authorities could, in fact, agree to a much more liberal immigration scheme without bringing down the entire totalitarian state. And Scoop and Charlie Vanik, I think, understood that with this legislation in place, many more people would be permitted to emigrate than would be the case without the legislation. And this was certainly true in the cauldron that created the legislation, which was the sudden imposition by the Soviet authorities of what was known as an education tax, a tax imposed on people wishing to emigrate who had an education, and the Soviet claim was that before being permitted to emigrate, they should reimburse the Soviet state for the costs of their education. Unfortunately, the amount demanded for reimbursement was prohibitive. It simply couldn't be paid by any Russian. So for a while, visas were purchased on behalf of the applicants by Westerners. It seemed pretty likely, and this was certainly the feeling of those Soviets seeking to emigrate, that the education tax was the first step in what was likely to be a series of measures to curtail immigration entirely. And in any case, it had the effect of burdening, in particular, those Soviet citizens who had some skill and could probably make their way in life outside the Soviet Union, and therefore those who were most eager to emigrate. So there was a sudden announcement that people wishing to emigrate, in addition to having to go through all of the other hurdles, would have to pay an immigration tax. I remember very well when this was announced, Scoop, who believed fervently in the right to emigrate, and who, by the way, believed that that was the seminal human right, because if you had the right to leave a country, the pressure on the authorities in that country to make life tolerable would, in fact, affect the whole range of human rights. But Scoop, who was passionate about enabling people to emigrate, and who observed that even the Soviets had signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which provides for the right of a citizen to leave his country and return to his country. Therefore, the Soviets were not in compliance. He believed that it was essential to move quickly in response to the education tax. And so a meeting was hastily convened of Senate staffers with a mandate to see what might be done. At that moment, a piece of trade legislation was making its way through Congress. The Nixon administration wanted to extend most favored nation status, and they wanted the authority to extend credits to the Soviet Union. This was part and parcel of the administration's détente strategy. And in the course of a meeting among Senate staff, some of whom were following very closely the progress of that trade legislation, the idea emerged of conditioning the Nixon proposed relaxations on trade restrictions on free immigration. And that was the beginning of what 2.5 years later would be passed as the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, Congressman Vanik in the House having picked up the mantle there. That's the history. To repeal Jackson-Vanik today, with all of the human rights concerns in Russia, with some countries who are subject to Jackson-Vanik, like North Korea, denying their citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate, would seem to me to repeal an iconic piece of legislation that is not a burden to anyone except those few places remaining that deny their citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate, and happen to be non-market economies, and the two often go together, whether the absence of a market is communist or fascist. So I puzzle at the desire to repeal it, except to the degree to which it is wrongly believed that it is necessary for freeing up the trade relationship between the United States and Russia to repeal Jackson-Vanik, which, as I said at the outset, simply doesn't apply. And I would hope that this administration, unlike its predecessors, would read the law, which is very clear, and simply declare that Jackson-Vanik, because Russia allows its citizens the right to emigrate, because it is a market economy, does not come under the strictures of the Jackson Amendment, does not require an annual review. And that, it seems to me, should take the issue of repeal of Jackson-Vanik off the table. Let me just conclude by sharing with you an amusing document. Shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a brief period when it was possible to examine documents, including Politburo documents, that had never been seen before. And among the documents that came to light in this window, the window sadly is closed and actually didn't remain open for very long, but a very brave Russian dissident, Vladimir Bukovsky, whose name may be known to some of you, was in that brief window given access to various archives. He had with him, when he was in the archives, a strange device that hadn't been seen around the Kremlin called a pocket scanner. And he scanned some thousands of documents before they figured out what he was doing, and that was the end of that. But one of the documents he got out was a Politburo conversation about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And for those of us who may have, indeed I'm certainly among those who wondered what the Soviet side was thinking and how the Soviet side was making its decisions as we were making ours, this document was marvelously instructive. And I'll just read you a paragraph or two from it. It'll give you the flavor. This is Brezhnev speaking. He says, "There is a serious obstacle to the official visit to the U.S. It's caused by Zionism. For a couple of months now, there has been a hysteria in America about the so-called education tax on people who are emigrating. I had ordered that we stop collecting this tax without getting rid of the law, just letting out about 500 Jews with no connections to sensitive work or to the party. Even if some of them are middle-aged, for example, let them go. They will talk about this and everyone will know. But when I checked on it, I got upset. The tax is still being collected." Taxes are pretty persistent in all societies, I guess. "The tax is still being collected. In 1973, 349 people left, and they paid 1.5 million rubles. I have a report on this." And Andropov, who was then head of the KGB, says, "That was before your directive." Does this sound like any government meeting any of you ever participated in? Brezhnev says, "We have been talking about this since last year. Orders are not being followed. This bothers me. I'm not talking about removing this law, but if you want to, we can discuss that as well. We have to make up our minds. Do we want to make money on this, or do we want to have a coherent policy toward the U.S.? Using their constitution, Jackson managed to introduce his amendment even before Nixon submitted the proposal to give us most favored nation status. So what is the use of all our work, all our efforts, if this is the result? Nothing." Well, it carries on like that, and clearly they are grappling, trying to come to terms with the amendment, which is exactly what those of us on this side of the water thought would happen. So to those who say that it had no influence, that it had no bearing, it had a pretty immediate influence in the Politburo. But far larger than that was the galvanizing effect it had on millions of Soviet citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike, who understood, perhaps for the first time, that there were people in the West, including a majority of the elected representatives of the Congress, who were prepared to stand with people who wanted their freedom and prepared to do something about it. And when you think of it in its historic terms, the idea of repealing it now seems to me ahistoric and would be tragic if it happened.
Thank you. Richard, I just want to take advantage of having you here to just follow up with a quick question. I mean, I think as a Russianist, I haven't thought too much about how the Jackson-Vanik has or hasn't applied to other countries. Can you just expand on that a little bit? And you mentioned North Korea, and is it actually utilized?
Well, no one's proposing most favored nation status for North Korea.
Right, right.
Although I've no doubt there is a lobbyist somewhere in town who has been employed to do that. Nor is anyone proposing government credits, although I would not exclude an administration, and forgive me for a brief criticism, that has made a fetish of the notion of engagement from coming up with some inventive idea to confer favors on the North Koreans. If they attempted to choose among those possible favors, either most favored nation status or U.S. government credits, they would be prevented from doing that by Jackson-Vanik. So it in the past has applied to other countries, of course. For a long time, it applied to a number of countries in Eastern Europe. And there, the provision within the amendment for annual waivers was used to very great effect. I'll give you one example. In room 135 of the old Senate office building, while Scoop was alive, a woman by the name of Catherine spent most of her time, she was on Scoop staff, poring over information that came to us about individuals in the Soviet Empire who wished to emigrate and who had been denied an opportunity to do so. And many of them came from Romania, from Hungary, from other countries. Those countries applied for and sometimes received a waiver which was provided for under the terms of the amendment. And it's an amazing footnote to the history. But every year, Scoop would sit down with various Eastern European ambassadors and negotiate freedom for people whose names had become known to us. So he would say to the ambassador, if you want a waiver this year, here's the list of people who are going to have to be granted freedom to leave. Most of them probably never knew that this process was taking place. Mm-hmm. And Scoop was a tough negotiator. He invariably came back with promises for visas for everyone on the list, in some cases hundreds of people. And only when those promises were fulfilled would a waiver be granted. So the amendment was used to very good effect with respect to a number of countries to obtain visas. And that process could still work today in those countries to which legally the amendment applies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
There aren't many left. One last point which I forgot, Laura. No. We don't know what the future is going to look like. I doubt, given the great currents of history, that Russia will once again become a non-market economy that denies its citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate. But there are other countries that could slide into recidivism in that regard, in which case the amendment is there to protect the right to emigrate of citizens of those countries.
Thank you. Thank you. We've been joined by the very distinguished Lyudmila Alexeyeva, and we'll call on her in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce Mark Talisman, who, as you heard, worked for Congressman Vanik in approximately the same period, shepherding the Jackson-Vanik amendment through Congress. Mr. Talisman has an extraordinarily impressive resume. He was led the Council of Jewish Federations, which worked on policy of the various Jewish federations in their contacts with the government. And he also was the founding vice chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, which, as you know, then led to the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So, Mr. Talisman, we're delighted that you could join us.
Thanks very much. This conference has been long in coming. I've been surprised over the years at the lack of interest in talking about this as opposed to things like repeal specifically. Before Tom Lantos died, he talked about repeal, and I had a long talk with him, a friend of many years, trying to puzzle out why it was that he felt that that was what he needed to do, because Congressman Vanik's own view from the beginning, and by the way, he died last year at the age of 95, always believing that this was set in concrete in American law now. He believed that firmly, because I can assure you in today's methodology of the House of Representatives, it'll never pass again if it were to be needed and brought up again de novo. It wouldn't pass. There have been many attempts to change it in many different ways by extending and so on. But I do believe that it is an organic piece of legislation, truly, and to lose it is never to have it again. I don't believe the world is static. I don't think anyone does. I think Richard's absolutely right in what he said, that there can be times that will be ugly, and so many nations, some of which we don't even know the names of. I must add also that it was not, in our view in the House, a Jewish amendment. It was an amendment that had broad coverage. We had the largest Hungarian population outside of Budapest living in our district. And I can tell you that the Hungarians wanted most favored nations because, after all, Congressman Vanik was a Slav. He had a long history in ethnic politics, and that's enough reason to give the Slavic nations and Hungary most favored nations per se. And yet and still there were very strong reasons not to do that. They didn't until, and by the way, as a favor to Congressman Vanik, to show how willing they were, they dropped, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of transmissions that were built outside of Budapest to show that they're willing to trade, which then immediately caused all sorts of other havoc in the market here. There were many, many, many non-Jews involved in the beneficiary of Jackson-Vanik, many. I meet them all the time. I see them all the time. I'm introduced now to their grandchildren. It applied to so many different people who we met in the basements of various clandestine venues praying. The believers were in strife, not only the Jews. The Jews were willing earliest to come to the Kremlin Wall. I don't know how many you remember that extraordinary early CNN live broadcast showing the truncheon-bearing, black leather-coated KGB beating the hell out of them on live television, which helped us obviously get more adherence quickly in the House floor, but just showed daily life of what they went through. I want to just give you a little note on Congressman Vanik himself. He was graduated from law school at age 16 in Cleveland, and under Ohio law, you had to be 18 to practice law. So he was in a settlement house in Cleveland during the beginnings of the Holocaust, and his assignment under a very noted sociologist director of that settlement house, Phil Bernstein, taking babies who were being brought over to Cleveland and other ethnic cities from the parents who were still alive in Germany and elsewhere, but wanted their babies in safety. As a Catholic kid, he really dealt him for the rest of his life nightmares that such a thing would be allowed to happen, ever. In 1971, he happened to be on his special Codell. He was not one to obey rules of the House and nicety, so he went with his black leather jacket on a motorcycle around the Soviet Union, which is an interesting way to do it, as anyone would know, who otherwise is usually followed closely by a fleet of KGB so-called unmarked cars. It was hard to do that to him, so he got to a lot of places. And the thunder that he felt in the imposition not only of the the tax that Richard properly mentioned on education for reimbursement, which was unpayable. It was so huge. But travel tax, in addition, beside everything else that was going on. And it drove him crazy. I was on bread and water for 3 or 4 days at the Congressional Reading Room after he got back, finding something that would do. And in fact, there were things that were close to it that were never in our later conversations during the Lincoln administration and the Woodrow Wilson administration, both of whom knew that trade with the Tsarist Russia was a difficult proposition then as it was later, because they were very smart about the fact that, yes, the United States needed raw materials, but not as much as Russia had to offer. The suspensions of trade took place during those 2 administrations unilaterally. The brightness of the staff on the Senate side was beyond belief. It mirrored the brightness of their principles. It was the kind of heady seminar one would pay a lot of money at an Ivy League school to attend, to be able to come up with this brilliant solution. The problem is we stood in the way in the House. That is to say, the House comes first according to the Constitution on matters of tax. So we had to pass it. The House is not a normal body, you might have noticed recently. It never has been. It's a place that is yeasty. It is actually called, as you might remember, the House of Representatives, for better or for worse, I add. And this kind of issue is third-degree burns for a lot of people. The man who heads this institution, the building in which we sat, was supposed to be a member of the Agriculture Department from his district in southeast Indiana on the river. And my job was to put him in the committee he wanted as a staff member dealing for my boss with the question of Committee on Committees, which is the automatic office of somebody who sits on the Ways and Means Committee. He wanted, this lunatic, to sit on Foreign Affairs Committee in the House from an agriculture district. That's the kind of mix-up that comes and provides a yeasty, totally ununderstandable method of legislation in the House. And that's what we faced. I want to tell you, because I've not had an opportunity much to talk about this in public, that this is an iconic legislation in many different ways, one of which is a strategy in the House to actually keep it alive to get it to the Senate. Huge problem, as you see with legislation going on right now, and in a form that might actually pass and be signed by a president. 25, 30%, maybe even 35% of the number of people who ultimately signed first, that is, became co-signatories on literally personally signing on the one copy available to have their name printed as a co-sponsor above the level of simply voting for it, were George Meany's friends, the labor movement. He was anti-communist. It was a no-brainer for them. They understood the issues exceedingly well and fast, and they signed. Vanik and I had the 2 copies that were going around. In case he missed somebody, I was able to get them, but nothing else. No inter-office stuff, because there were people watching, one of whom was the Secretary of State office, who didn't want this at all, as you might remember, especially in the House, to start it off, because the Senate couldn't start until we did, under the Constitution, until we finished. And secondly, the issue of being able to garner a sufficient number of votes that was not simply a majority plus 1, 218, but members, and this happened recently, not in the same way, but it did happen, where members forgot that they had signed as co-sponsors, and when it came time to vote 2 years later, they voted against their legislation. And I had stuff in the House defeated after enormous labor of millions of people only because of that reason. Some peripatetic thing, some last-minute lobbying, some God knows what. So my objective always in legislation is to make sure that there is a majority plus 97 or 220 or something. And so there's plenty of cushion to take the guy in the back room and beat the hell out of him until he comes around to his senses. 1/3 of the people were talked into it, literally. And then the phenomenon that arose here, which must be paid due deference, and beyond that, is a public movement that was beyond belief, that grew out of nowhere, but it literally, in fact, grew out of somewhere. The largest single lobby activity that went on in Washington during the Holocaust on behalf of saving Jews after it was clearly known what was happening was an attempt by 25,000 Orthodox rabbis from New York in January of 1944. They had leased that many seats on that many Penn Central trains to come to Washington. They had a firm appointment with the President of the United States, you know who. They came here, and Harry Hopkins came out and said he's busy. Never happened. There were so many examples of that in everybody's family, including and especially mine personally, where things didn't happen and people, as they say, went up the chimney in smoke. There's a lot more material coming out now to demonstrate, and there's a book being written to nail it all down in one book, so there's no more chatter. That has infected and effected the Jewish community forever. The failure to act. They were told essentially, shut up, don't become a fifth column, you'll ruin the war effort. They were told, we shall, by the President of the United States, we shall win the war early, and that will take care of the problem. None of which was true. The next effort was when the Jews in our family who lived in the Soviet Union, all of the Soviet Union, wherever it was, received brown paper wrapped packages in the late 40s and 50s into the 60s of goods to live on. That was our best effort we could get together as a community and individuals somehow to escape the horror again in our minds of not acting properly, not doing something. So when Jackson-Vanik came along, out came this organizational efforts, first by dint of trying everything they could think of, and then by organization. Levi Strauss became an economic tool in a political field that increased their profits, I'd say, by 50% the first year alone, by what was taken in there as a trading device to leave with dissidents, refuseniks, others, to use as currency when they lost their houses and their apartments and their food. I mean, all kind. A pack of Marlboros was gilted. It was pure gold. It was so many things. For us to look at people who were like us, they had our names, they were relatives in some cases, and understand that they were willing to sustain the bright, white, hot light of open publicity in the West if you only keep it going in the West on our behalf. That was the test for a lot of us. How could we do less? And they would say, if you stop, we're dead. So they proceeded. So that the machine that developed, which still exists for many of the regions, is mighty and reversed the history and the potential history that would be developed again, yet again, as a catastrophe. So that was that. And still, I am so troubled personally that it's sort of interesting. I told Richard when we came down, it's an odd situation to be in for somebody like me who eats and lives legislative process, has helped 19 countries democratize and have parliaments and all of these things over this period of a generation and a half. To come to a point now where, as Richard properly said, people do things on something so important without even reading the basic legislation because of current needs, lobby needs, whatever the hell it is, that affects enormous numbers of people as right now unable to be known because it could happen in the near future or the long-term future. This was a hard-fought battle for an organic piece of legislation. And as Richard absolutely is right in regard to reading and interpreting Jackson-Vanik for its meaning. Russia doesn't have a problem. It's one of those things, if they keep talking about it wrongly, and those who are doing that keep pressing them, they're going to end up in a problem because people will think that they're right here. And then you really got problems before committees and other places. I had a sad situation in Miami in the beginning of an exhibit I did on the 20th century in posters of the Jewish community, starting with the Jacques' original poster in 1898 to computers in the Jewish world. Because there were a gaggle of kids from a school. My wife and I loved to hide in the bushes of an exhibit space, the plants, and listen to what the customer's saying. These were kids. These were 8th graders. Half of the group of 35 were Russian Jewish kids at this day school. They were asking hard questions of their American kids, friends, about why those posters, 37 of them, in regard to this whole movement on moving Soviet Jews out, were in Russian. They had no idea. None. That's how easy the mind forgets in a family, or wants to forget. And constitutionally, it seems to me that the larger body of politic is in even worse condition on not sustaining this. In Jewish life, we have in our life cycle Passover with a Haggadah. Haggadah is a story. The story is told religiously over and over, not to forget the origins. Even though it sounds strange, the history is correct. And this becomes that kind of thing, to me, legislatively, to wreck something that you'll never be able to establish again. Congressman Vanik believed that this was an arrow in the basic quiver of opportunities legislatively forever in the United States. And he didn't feel it was hyperbole for him to say that, because it worked. And let me say a little bit about that. I have to tell you, at the beginning of all of this, I was so skeptical. It's sort of these legislative prayers one says in the morning that the day's going to go all right and you'll still be upright by the end of the day, hoping you do right, when serious choices are to be made. This was the ideal thing to do to meet the problem, which is exactly why signals go off in the place called the House of Representatives that it won't work. We'll have a tussle, everybody will get up and bellow, and in the end it won't happen. And worse, it could pass, and then it won't work. I remember above the fold, early on, Arbatov, the Soviet-American Trade Council, and Donald Kendall, the head of the American Trade Council, were seen in their tennis togs on his estate, Kendall's estate in Long Island, after they had finished the splendid trade deal they had just finished. This was their method of PR in the midst of this. What was the trade deal? 1 bottle of Pepsi for 1 bottle of Stoli. It didn't set well across the United States when we were trying to pass something to demonstrate that is the nature of trade. Those were the kinds of vagaries that this kind of proposition would run into, we felt. The second problem is what exactly among the raw materials is the basis of trade for the United States, which has stockpiles of the very same thing we're trying to sell off on the other side of the aisle. Huge problems. And then the vagaries itself of dealing with the Soviets. We had a lot of experience, all of us, particularly on the Ways and Means Committee, and it was never one of those handshakes one could trust because they were dealing with their problems, as this memo points out, where their bureaucracy was a bureaucracy. So as a consequence, when it began to develop that it was actually going to work, you don't take a treasure like that and trash it. You just don't do that. It actually has been proved to work, which is rare for a lot of legislation, and became a model, at least in the verbiage of conversation about human rights, which is precious to me because there's so few opportunities to have actually made a difference in my lifetime on the Hill. It was such a bitter experience to see how easy and cheap the conversations were when people's lives were at stake. So that to have this gem available is not only a tribute to all who suffered to help it happen with literally their own presence, their own bodies, but then not understand why on this side it should remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think one of the remarkable things about this amendment is how it's quite naturally tied in many people's mind to the immigration, particularly of Jews, since they were by far the largest majority of people who immigrated. And neither Senator Jackson nor Congressman Vanik were Jewish, although I think many assumed Senator Jackson must have been, in particular because why would either of them be fighting so hard for these rights? But I think both of them just believed very strongly in the more universal aspect of human rights. And Lyudmila Mikhailovna Alexeyeva is someone who has fought for human rights without respect to religion or origin and believes in it more universally. We're very honored to have. I'm sorry you didn't wear your little snowflake costume that we saw you in on the front page of the New York Times, but I think you all know that Lyudmila Mikhailovna is really the soul of the human rights community in Russia, if not more internationally. We all look to her for guidance and a wise thought, and I know she really serves as the leader in so many ways to so many of the groups with whom we work, and the activists and politicians. She is a founding member of the Moscow-Helsinki group, but I think both her stature and her role within the community cannot be exaggerated, and we wanted to bring in her perspective on the role of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and kind of how it relates to the struggle for human rights today. So, Lyudmila Mikhailovna.
Thank you. I will try to speak English, but excuse me, my terrible English pronunciation. It's real Russian pronunciation of English text. Excuse me. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, adopted by the U.S. Congress in 1974, became a significant event in our country. It is not a secret that this amendment was a reaction to a movement of Soviet Jewry who wanted to move back to their historical homeland, Israel. The movement was born by the anti-Semitism, which became the USSR state policy after the end of the Second World War and intensified every next year. I very well remember campaign of 1949 against Cosmopolitan. It was the official name for this anti-Semitic campaign. I was a student of Moscow State University at that time. In our historical department, as well as across the whole university, the whole country, the Jewish teachers have been dismissed and Jewish students were turned out from universities. Jewish people lost jobs in all spheres. And in 1953, shortly before the death of Stalin, doctors who treated him were arrested, and most of them were Jews. It was the peak of anti-Semitic campaign in the USSR. Anti-Semitism stayed the state policy and after the Stalin's death, maybe till the perestroika. This long-year policy produced grassroots anti-Semitism in Russia, in the Soviet Union. Jews in the Soviet Union felt not comfortable. They understood that neither they nor their children would have any perspective in this country. So it is quite understandable that any of them would live anywhere. In 1949, Israel became an independent state, and many Jews dreamed to live there. But they could only dream. The Soviet Union, under the Stalin's ruling and after his death, was strongly isolated from other world, and departure from the country for the majority of population was not possible. Meanwhile, in 60s, when the general atmosphere became warmer, the Zionist movement has appeared. From the mid of 60s, the most courageous Zionists began to appeal with requests for deportation to Israel. After several such permissions were given, the number of requests increased. The movement became to be mass after the Six-Day War in 1967. I can witness that the victory of Israel in this war encouraged Soviet Jewry Soviet Jews remember they are Jews and be proud to be Jews. Although, despite of large number of those applied for the permission for departure, only few lucky people got it. Meanwhile, the movement of Soviet Jews aroused and response Jewish movement in countries of Western Europe and in the United States especially. In 1964 in New York, Jacob Birnbaum has created the organization Students Fighting to Support Soviet Jews. And very soon, numerous organizations to support of Soviet Jews were created in the United States. The Union of Council of Soviet Jewry was created in 1976. The Conference of Soviet Jewish Issues was developed. The permanent links were established with activists of Soviet Jewish movement in Moscow and other cities. The flow of tourist Jews from the USA to the USSR was promoted the establishment of personal contacts with activists of Jewish movement and with families of those who received the refusal for departure. These people needed moral support as well as financial help. Such contacts excited interest to the culture and history of Jewish people, promoted revival of traditions forgotten in the USSR. Soviet Jews began to celebrate Jewish holidays and learn Hebrew. I had many acquaintances among Moscow Jews, and I know it was so just this time. Such activity from two sides was effective. From the end of 60s, the permissions for departure were not ready anymore. The number of those who appealed for permission was increasing. The increased numbers of those applied caused the increasing of number of those who were refused. These people were in desperate situation, without job and any sources for living. They had to stay in such impossible conditions for indefinite time, and many of them for long, long years. This desperation forced the desperate actions, open declarations, demonstrations, hunger strikes. Jewish organizations in the USA and European countries intensified their activity in helping people, gathering funds, touristic travels, pickets next to the Soviet consular departments, mass marches for protection of Soviet Jews, declarations, mass media, lobbying. This pressure from two parts influenced American and Western diplomats. Parliamentarians from different countries came to the USSR to meet with those who were refused and with activists of Jewish movement in the USSR. The subject of closed nature of the Soviet Union and impossibility of leaving country for its citizens become popular in Western mass media in Europe and in the United States. If we look through the periodical of that years, one can think that only Jewish movement was known in the West. But in the same time, in 1960s, human rights movement appeared, and since beginning played a very important role in inner atmosphere in the Soviet Union. In some republics, such as Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia, Armenia, Georgia, independent national movement acted, and independent religious movement, which were much older than human rights movement and Jewish movement. Human rights movement was the less numerous, but it was concentrated at Moscow and had the maximal resonance inside the country. It attracts other movements because its periodical issue, Chronicle of Current Events, became the source of information about all independent movement in the USSR. Moscow-Helsinki Group, which was created in 1976, promoted all of this movement, information about all of this movement on the ground of humanitarian articles of Helsinki agreements. It was also true for Jewish movement for migration. The most prominent activists of Jewish movement, Vitaly Rubin and Anatoly Natan Sharansky, were among founders of the Moscow-Helsinki Group. Vladimir Slepak and Natan Maiman joined Moscow-Helsinki Group soon after the beginning of the group activity. Of course, human rights activists from the beginning of the Jewish movement sympathized this struggle because they considered the right to leave country and come back one of the most important rights. The human rights activist position was many times sounded by academician Sakharov. He stated that the right to free leaving country and coming back into it stipulated in the law heavily affects the realization of all other civil and economical rights. If both authorities and people know that any citizen can freely leave country when he or and she is dissatisfied with the situation in the country, it will positively influence the relationship between power and citizens and will weaken the pressure on the power of the power to the society. In the letter of the USA Congress about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, Andrei Sakharov stressed the importance of the right of leaving country and coming back not only for Jews, but for all Soviet citizens as well. He drew the attention of the Congress on the fact that there are dozens of thousands other citizens in the country, Germans, Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Armenians, Estonians, Latvians, Turkish, and other ethnics who want to leave country and struggle for that for years, feeling endless difficulties and indignity. The initiator and the leader of Moscow-Helsinki Group, Yuri Orlov, wrote in 1973 in his open letter to Leonid Brezhnev about the necessity to repeal of a ban for free travel abroad, explaining that this right is essential for equalization intellectual potentials between countries and cutting retardation of the Soviet science from the world science. He insisted on the liability of traveling abroad in the right moment and for the time needed for science, for engineer, student, writer, painter, or any other citizen. He proved that this prohibition is not beneficial not for citizens, nor for the state. The idea Jackson-Vanik Amendment was created as a reaction on obstacles built by Soviet powers for Jewish departure to Israel. Charles Vanik introduced the bill into the House of Representatives in February 1973. The bill was supported by half of congressmen. The bill was the direct reaction for the decision of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, published in August 1972. According to this decision, those who wanted to immigrate had to pay all governmental expenses spent for their education in the USSR. The amount was so large that only few could pay it and leave the USSR. Jewish activists consider this decision as a document which turns all people who were educated in the country into the slaves. This decision also drew the indignation abroad. 21 Nobel laureates from different countries addressed this collective protest. All Jewish organizations in the United States and Western Europe countries reacted the same. The reaction of the Kremlin on the indignation was rather fast. The Kremlin was especially worried about the perspective of adoption of the bill introduced by Congressman Vanik. He made it in February, and already in March, Soviets declared that those who immigrate would not pay any tax. George Arbatov issued at that time the statement that sanctions which limit the trade between USA and USSR and which were imposed because of the existing problems with living of Jewish people could lead to new wave of anti-Semitism in the USSR. Although in April 1973, Henry Jackson introduced the bill into the Senate. This bill was supported by the majority of senators. On December 20, 1974, both chambers adopted the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and the President Gerald Ford signed it. On January 3, 1975, this amendment became a law. Jewish movement participants have gotten the news enthusiastically and disproved the skeptics' fears that adoption of this amendment could damage the whole movement or some its participants. Human rights activists welcomed this amendment not only as a measure which makes the situation of Jewish people who were refused in departure permission easier. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment was for us the evidence of the fact that legislative power of the United States was ruled not only by reflection of practical profit for its country in the sense of real politics, but also struggles for human values such as freedom of individuals and rights for anybody whenever he or she lives. In this connection, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment introduced the idea of Jimmy Carter, who 2 years later declared in his pre-electoral campaign that he would build the relations with other countries independence on observance of human rights in these countries. It is not occasional that the Senator Henry Jackson, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when introduced his amendment to the Law of Commerce. I think that the right address of Andrei Sakharov to the U.S. Congress promoted the adoption of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Academician Sakharov wrote in this address, if any nation has the right to choose a political system under which the nation wants to live, it is particularly true for the individual. The country where citizens are deprived of these elementary rights is not free, even if nobody wants to realize this right. Sakharov ended this address by following words. I express my hope that U.S. Congress, which reflects the wish and traditional love to freedom of the American people, would realize its historical responsibility before the humanity and find forces to be above the up-to-the-minute group interests of profit and prestige. The U.S. Congress satisfied the expressions of our prominent compatriot. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment played an important role in weakening difficulties for Jews to immigrate to the USSR in 1970-1980s. And I am sure that it was not occasional that the very first civil right obtained by the Soviet citizen in Perestroika period was the right to free live and come back in the country. The fact that this right was asserted for dozens of years by activists of Jewish movement and human rights activists and by all Soviet citizens, and all these efforts were effectively supported by the U.S. Congress, and U.S. and European societies also played a role. I state that now, when for years of Vladimir Putin's presidency, we lost almost all civil rights, the only right which we still have is the right to free live and come back in the country. This right is widely used by millions of Russian citizens for tourist trips, vacations, education, and work. And I came here to make this report in Honorable Institute also due to this right. Now, the right to free live and come back obligate in Russia. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment had played its role, and now this amendment became anachronism. And I think now this amendment should be abolished for Russia. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Lyudmila Mikhailovna. So, before turning to questions, I guess I just would want to follow up because you did speak about this a little bit yesterday. Lyudmila Mikhailovna, you don't have any concerns about kind of giving the Putin presidency or the Putin regime a free pass in terms of if you would if we were to repeal Jackson-Vanik, aside from the other issues that were raised today?
Текст своего выступления я приготовила заранее, и поэтому читала его по-английски. Отвечу по-английски на ваши вопросы так, чтобы вы это поняли. Я не могу, мне будет помогать переводчик.
Well, actually, I prepared the text of my presentation in English in advance, and I read it. And I was very efficient at that, I hope so. But I cannot answer the questions in English, so the interpreter will help you to answer. So if you have any questions for the lady.
Вчера мы действительно обсуждали этот вопрос, и разгорелась серьезная дискуссия по поводу того, каким образом может быть отменена поправка Jackson-Vanика.
Yesterday we had a whole full day of passionate discussions in terms of whether this amendment should be repealed or not.
Люди люди, хорошо знающие ситуацию в Соединенных Штатах, настаивали, что эта поправка должна быть отменена без всяких условий, просто потому, что те условия, которые в этой поправке требовались, уже соблюдаются.
People who understand the situation in the United States of America very well, they actually advocated the view that this amendment should be repealed without any additional conditions.
Потому что уже соблюдаются.
Because all those conditions, they are already realized, they are present.
Но вы знаете, я знаю наших политиков.
But I know our politicians.
И я знаю, что если будет просто без всяких условий отменена эта поправка, они воспримут это так, что значит на Западе считают, что в области прав человека в России все в порядке, и можно не волноваться и по этому поводу не говорить.
But I know our politicians, and I think if this amendment will be repealed without no additional conditions, that will be kind of a message to the Russians that the situation with human rights in Russia is all right, and they can relax.
Не мне советовать, как это сделать. Я совершенно не понимаю ни процедур парламентских, ни традиций американской политической жизни, но я знаю, что каким-то образом, вы сами подумайте, каким, это должно быть обставлено, отказ от этой поправки, заявлением по поводу того, что это единственное право, гражданское право, которое в России сейчас соблюдается, а остальные-то уже не соблюдаются, нет честных, вы простите.
I apologize, so basically I'm not an expert in legal procedures of how laws are passed in the United States of America, and of course there are certain traditions and legal procedures there should, and I'm not an expert in giving an advice how to do that. But I do believe that it should be done in the way to preserve other human rights of Russian citizens, because the only right that is present right now in Russia is the right to freely leave the country and come back. What about the rest of human rights?
У нас постепенно отняли все выборы от губернаторов до местных властей.
We were deprived of the right to freely elect governors, as well as the heads of the oblast departments or regional governors.
У нас нет свободы политической жизни, у нас
have no freedom of political life.
У нас нет свободной жизни для неполитических общественных организаций.
We do not have a freedom to assemble freely for political organizations.
У нас безнаказанно убивают тех, кто не нравится своими поступками или своими высказываниями властям.
Innocent people are killed in our country just because they dared to make certain political statements.
И если отменить поправку Джексона-Ваника и не обратить внимание на все это, то вы как бы соглашаетесь с тем, с той политической и общественной атмосферой, которая сейчас существует в России.
And if this amendment will be repealed without no additional conditions, so basically the statement to the Russia will be that you agree with the present situation with human rights in Russia.
Мне бы очень хотелось, чтобы эта конференция в этом уважаемом институте помогла найти какое-то решение, как это сделать.
I certainly hope that this conference will be very instrumental and will find the ways and means how to do it in an appropriate way.
Thank you. Well, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I didn't know if Richard or Mark, you wanted to comment?
I think at the risk of repetition is a good opportunity to make the point that Jackson-Vanik ceased applying to the Soviet Union when the right to emigrate was available. Therefore, it isn't necessary to repeal it in order to end its application to Russia. It doesn't apply to Russia today. And I think you are quite right in observing that a repeal of the amendment would be interpreted as a seal of approval for the current state of human rights in Russia. Happily, there's no need to repeal it. It is not interfering with trade in any way. It has no bearing on commercial relations between the United States and Russia. We could, if we wished, extend credits without any limitation to Russia. Russia now receives the effects of most favored nation status. There is confusion, and I made this point before you arrived. There is confusion about the status of the law. The law is clear. It simply does not apply to Russia. If 20 years from now, Russia were to be transformed backward and once again denied its citizens the right to immigrate, then it would once again have effect. But now it has no effect. So there is really no compelling argument for repealing it.
What was the reaction to this discussion on the Hill in terms of, was there any understanding on the Hill about the meaning of repeal, as Richard has indicated?
I think it's fair to say that I think a number of staffers seem to understand the symbolism of Jackson-Vanik. I don't think we got into it at quite that level. I think there was an understanding that it was irrelevant for Russia in terms of immigration, and irrelevant because it's not a non-market economy. But we didn't quite have that level of exposition of the
I
issue.
just want to make the point that it is good that you were able to report what went on the Hill and how serious it is now, because it also defines what Jackson-Vanik is not. The human rights movement is alive and well, and a lot of work needs to be done independent of Jackson-Vanik in regard to all of this long list of things going on within the Soviet Union under the Prime Minister.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think we have time. Will, how much time do we have? Oh, can't we take more? We started 15 minutes late, so let's do at least 15 minutes. We'll just go. Whoever has a hand up. Okay, the woman back there. Sorry, I don't know your name.
I'm Jody
It's on video.
Okay. I'm Joni Feingold. I'm from George Mason University. My question is twofold. One, I was curious as to, other than Jewish groups, what other groups, lobby groups, advocacy groups, whatever, help support the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and the fight to get it passed. And my second question is, for all of you, what legacy do you think it has had on other legislation, particularly the International Religious Freedom Act? Thanks.
By the way, I just want to take one moment to promote a film that we helped support called Reassessing, which is a very wonderful film made by an American filmmaker about the history of the Soviet Jewry movement, and the passage of Jackson-Vanik plays a very important role in that and gives a very personal and I think very good approach to the whole history of that movement.
The interwoven relationships, interfaith, were extensive and daily, including organized meetings. There were the believers that I talked about, many of whom were suffering for their practice in basements and otherwise being hassled, if not worse, all over the Soviet Union. And the Baha'i, for example, who had small numbers but still were there, had a habit, and still do, of not lobbying and being in public about their needs like this. So some of us had to do their work on the Hill. as happened later on in Iran and other places. So it was very, very wide, and the consequences were very harsh for them.
It was a very broad coalition, human rights groups of all descriptions. The trade unions under the AFL-CIO, for example. So it was a galvanizing proposal, and that was, and Lyudmila Alexeyeva might wish to say more about this, it had the same effect on Soviet human rights activists and dissidents. It cheered them enormously. I mean, Sakharov was not Jewish, of course. There's no reference to Jews in the amendment, but as the history shows, the Jews were both activist in the Soviet Union, not exclusively, but they were the most activist, and they elicited the most support outside the Soviet Union. So many people believe today that this amendment affects only Jews, but of course it doesn't.
Other questions? Steve Hansen.
Yes, Steve Hansen, University of Washington. I just want to make sure I understand the technicality. Oh, sorry about that. Steve Hansen, University of Washington. I'd just like to follow up on the technicality about the congressional annual waivers. So apparently, two presidents, in different ways, both Clinton and Bush, have said we now call on Congress to act to move beyond the amendment because it doesn't apply to Russia. But then this annual process does still take place. So what form of presidential waiver would go past that and make it clear that actually Congress is out of the loop from this point on?
No waiver is necessary. The waiver has persisted in part, this gets long and complicated, but in part because there have been trade disputes. And unfortunately, what was intended as a very narrow proposition, if you don't allow people to emigrate, you don't get these benefits, has now acquired hangers-on in the poultry industry and elsewhere. But the amendment is very clear, and administrations that have requested waivers have done so, I think, either without legal advice or ignoring the law for political reasons, because the amendment takes effect until the president declares that a country is in compliance, and at that point it ceases to have effect. And it's been obvious that Russia was in compliance for many years.
The presidential statements so far have not actually said officially Russia's in compliance. They've just said we call on Congress to do waivers. Is that what I understand?
That's correct, and they've done that under political pressure largely from economic interests. But President Obama could tomorrow declare that he finds that Russia is in compliance with Jackson-Vanik, and it therefore no longer applies. And if he were to do that, no annual waiver would be required, and presumably Putin would stop complaining.
Other questions? Yes, in the middle. You in the...
Hi, this is very informative. My name is Mindy Reiser from an NGO called Global Peace Services. I'd like some clarification on the two parts of the amendment. One is it applies to non-market economies, and two, those economies which prohibit immigration. Well, there are mixed economies, and clearly Russia is one of those. And if one part is met and not another, does that still mean that the country is not subject to this amendment?
No, both. So a non-market economy that allows its citizens to emigrate is unaffected by Jackson-Vanik. A market economy that denies its citizens is affected by Jackson-Vanik. There are the two conditions, and it's very clear in the legislation. So it doesn't apply to Russia because Russia allows immigration, even if one were to conclude that it's a non-market economy, but of course it is essentially now a market economy.
Linda.
Linda Mason-Wilgus with the Jackson Foundation. Just following up on her question, Does the Trade Act define non-market, or rather market economy? Because it seems that there's been a lot of talk over this issue of Russia having a mixed economy, and people debate whether it's truly a market economy at this point.
But with respect to the law, even if it were still a non-market economy, the fact that it allows citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate would remove it from application of Jackson-Vanik.
I have to just follow up and ask one question. Yesterday, Karina Moskalenka suggested that we all begin to start drafting a new law that might impact human rights in Russia in a different way. And I think, admittedly, she didn't necessarily say that she was a big expert on the topic. But do you think that there's anything that the U.S. should be doing in the realm of legislation? Or should we stick with what Sarah Mendelsohn was saying yesterday about hearings and maybe a better use of aid money? Is there a role for a new Jackson-Vanik amendment that might, a different kind of thing that might impact the current issues in Russia?
That's what I was beginning to say after the previous presentation. This is an opportunity for the human rights movement in 2010 to determine the answer to that question. Expanding, twisting, doing things to the Jackson-Vanik is not going to be fruitful on the floor of the House, particularly, I think, given what goes on there. Because everyone has lobby things they want to tack on to Jackson-Vanik. Poultry dominates, if you can imagine. I mean, that's what happens at the end. I mean, the point is that that's the question that needs to be examined now in this modern age, in whatever the economies are, because this is a new paradigm and it's a new world, and so much has happened since then. From my standpoint, the creativity for a mature human rights community to tackle is really quite delicious for me, because we need new tools. There had been attempts in the past to expand the Jackson-Vanik legislatively, and they went down in flames over the years.
Look, Jackson-Vanik succeeded, in my view, because there was proportionality between what was being demanded and what was being withheld. And even a Brezhnev could worry in a Politburo meeting about whether they could manipulate it, allow some people to leave in order to gain the economic benefits. There's a limit to how much could have been demanded. If we had asked for free speech in a totalitarian state, obviously we were never going to get that. Could we get visas for tens of thousands of people? Yeah, that was manageable. So it seems to me Jackson-Vanik has had its place in history, and it should be left there as a symbol. There are things that can be done to promote human rights in Russia, and I would hope we would do them. But I don't think a repetition of a Jackson-Vanik model would be very effective in today's environment.
Question in the back.
Hi, I'm Kathy Fitzpatrick. I'm with the Jacob Blaustein Institute in New York. And I wanted to ask exactly, given the sort of institutional benefits of the Jackson-Vanik process historically, it was always that the hearing process, the ability of citizens to monitor the situation in their countries and then bring it forward to hearings here. And that was an annual process. That itself seems to me worth keeping as a functionality of the amendment, even if all you do every year is say that it doesn't apply to Russia. So my question is, following on some of the other questions, what is the precise mechanism within the language of the amendment itself that would lead you to a perpetual presidential waiver? Because you had the annual waiver, it's not clear how you would jump to then make that stay perpetually. And just as a corollary, keeping it in place, would there be a political willingness to apply it to the Central Asian countries, which you could argue don't have the market economies, and there's also many instances of they keep a block on immigration and immigration? Thanks.
Look, the amendment doesn't apply to Russia. The annual waiver makes no sense under the terms of the law. I mean, that's the answer. There are things we could and should be doing, and I think hearings are very important. But you don't need Jackson-Vanik to have a hearing on political murders in Russia when they take place. If you had a leadership in the Congress that wanted to put the spotlight on human rights abuses in Russia, it could do that, and it doesn't need Jackson-Vanik to do it. And it should do it. And in my view, the administration should be doing it as well. Silence is a form of acquiescence. And we ought to be saying a great deal more when people go to jail wrongly, when people are murdered for their political views in Russia. Russia today is potentially sensitive to that kind of open criticism. We should be doing much more of it, in my view.
Given the state of membership that Russia seeks in multinational organizations in Europe, and given the fact that they're allowed to attend these meetings, gives this room an opportunity. I see many people in the room who I know how to work those things, to set up a counterforce of an annual review in public, and demands of in each of the countries involved to support the notion of examining those very things annually, and maybe setting up a formal mechanism to do it in a way that doesn't simply draw the ire of Putin, but says if you want to live in a normalized arrangement in this modern economy and modern world, these are the ways modern nations behave and don't behave. It's the model that I find in the work I do with the court, the European Union. I mean, their standards are there now. So much has happened since Jackson-Vanik in regard to these issues, and the establishment of the courts after the genocides and all of these kinds of things, that I would think it wouldn't take too long with bright minds to create a new institutional framework that says the world stands up and says this is not working. That's all. Behaviors need to be changed.
I think we have time for one or possibly two more questions. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Dennis Moraz of George Washington University. Continuing that you just mentioned multinational organizations, and given that there is still a slight possibility that Russia would enter WTO, that also gives its members free most favored nations treatment, will the consent of the United States actually mean de facto repeal of Jackson-Vanik amendment, that Russia will forever enjoy most favored nation treatment, and if the United States, if the opportunities dictate, will try to then impose Jackson-Vanik in Russia again, this will mean violation of WTO obligations of the United States?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's an interesting legal question. Jackson-Vanik applied to non-market economies that denied their citizens the right and the opportunity to emigrate as of the date on which the legislation was passed. So, as I've said several times, it no longer applies because the two criteria are unmet. If we now extend it, but go through this unnecessary waiver, if Russian accession to the WTO obliges the United States to extend most favored nation status, then Jackson-Vanik would continue to be inapplicable to Russia. But no one is proposing that it be applied to Russia anyway. Mm-hmm. I believe that Vladimir Putin wants it repealed as a triumphal rejection of what he regards as an unwarranted interference in the internal affairs of his beloved Soviet Union. This is about rejecting what was done. It is not about trade. It is not about normal relations. It's all about the symbolism of rejecting this piece of legislation and rejecting the history.
I sort of turn around and ask the question of you. have we lost our appetite for protests in public as a person is wrongfully murdered? There was precious little commentary anywhere. I mean, and all of it, all of it up, is a question of a menu annually for what is right and what is wrong in a new context. You know, putting it all on Jackson-Vanik is more than Jackson-Vanik could stand. It has confused it over the years, in fact, because in their minds, people apply to Jackson-Vanik what is not in the law.
Well, I'd like to thank the three very passionate and experienced panelists for this beginning our discussion today. We'll have a short break. I think we have to keep the breaks a little bit shorter, 5 minutes until the next panel. So thank you, Richard Pearl, Mark Talisman, and Lyudmila Alexeyeva.